Hi, thanks so much, and thanks everybody for attending today. This is actually the third time that I've given this talk at an All Things Open or OS 101 event. And it's continued to kind of evolve from each time as Linux has sort of continued to grow. But I really like this forum for this talk specifically, the Open Source 101. I want to say this is my third year. I was just thinking about it before, so I can't remember if it's my third year or my fourth year doing participating in OS 101. And I really love this show. And I think that, especially, the students in this audience and folks who are just sort of coming into this industry, you're coming in at a very interesting time when, we're looking at kind of our, I heard a statistic recently from IDC that 66% of the global GDP, 66% of products that are paid for will be digital assets by the end of this year, by 2022. And a lot of that, I think our current landscape and everything has accelerated some of that, and of course the pandemic and everything. But it's really quite a time to be coming into software. And this talk specifically, Linux, if Linux isn't already in your tool belt, now is really the time. Linux is underpinning so many of these other supportive technologies that are really changing and evolving the way that we develop software now. It's underpinning containers. There is no container orchestration and all of this stuff without, solid Linux, Linux-like and Linux-driven operating systems underpinning all of it. And so, Linux is a discipline more so than an operating system, as you'll see, but it's something that's really going to help you, I think, leverage a lot of other open source technologies and a lot of other modern and DevOps friendly tool chains that are out there. So anyway, I really like giving this talk specifically at Open Source 101. I hope you enjoy it. Please feel free to stop me at any point. If you have a question, I'm going to do my best to check the Q&A panel. This is a new format for everybody. I'm used to doing these talks in person, like I think most people are. So it actually helps me to have some of that interaction so that I don't feel like a crazy person just recording through my computer in my office. So anyway, I appreciate that. So let's get going. First, a little bit more about me. I am the chief evangelist over our open source and API management assets at Perforce. Perforce is a company really that has a portfolio of a lot of different DevOps technologies in it. One of them is our OpenLogic offering, which is basically just an offering that allows us to provide support for enterprises that want to use free software. And I also oversee our API management part of our portfolio, which is our Akana product. My background is very much in software development. But as I've kind of moved through that role and moved through into more leadership work and more, I guess, this type of thing, speaking at conferences and evangelizing, that work has changed from software development to more talking about development and trends in development and new things that are happening there. So that's a lot of the work that I do now. Feel free to look me up on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out and connect. The networks are so important. Especially in open source circles. It's a very social means of development that is open source. So please feel free to reach out. I will accept your LinkedIn. I do share a lot of stuff. I do have a lot of these types of webinars and talks, things that you can already sort of find out there if you want to look at some of that content as well. So anyway, feel free to reach out. Okay, let's talk about Linux. So in order to really understand Linux, you have to understand the history of the Unix operating system, and specifically the class of operating systems that started as Unix operating systems. So this is back in the 70s with Bell Labs and the introduction of the early Bell Labs operating systems that spun out into the Berkeley software distribution of Unix, and that ultimately became Sun OS, which is a commercial Solaris product. Meanwhile, kind of alongside all of this heavy and commercial Unix development, the GNU project, which spun out of the Free Software Foundation, had started supporting a small open source operating system project called Linux, which would ultimately become GNU Linux. And that would become, the Android operating system, and ultimately would become Linux as we know it now. But alongside all of this, earlier variants of the Unix operating system were just sort of blooming all over the place, right? We had Solaris with SunOS, the Next Step operating system, which would evolve into the Mac OS X operating system that we know now, which is still powered by BSD Unix at its core. On the SVR5 distributions, which were these heavy enterprise class and sometimes even mainframe distributions of Unix. We're spinning out, including things like HPUX and Solarix and IBM AIX, right? So Linux as an open source operating system was very much evolving alongside these sort of heavyweight Unix operating systems that were powering, big commercial heavyweight software. So this is an example of the boot up screen of an SVR5 variant, the HPUX variant on a Hewlett-Packard workstation. And if you're familiar at all with the boot up screen of like a Red Hat variant of Linux, for instance, this might look a little bit familiar, right? Because some of that, these boot sequences and things like that were inspired by these commercial and enterprise class distributions of Unix. I mean, certainly Red Hat Enterprise Linux and its variants are aimed towards an enterprise audience, right? And so they solve a lot of the same problems, and they speak to a lot of the same use cases. So that's a bit of a history of Unix, but let's take a look at Linux's history, like we see in this slide, because sort of on its own, Linux itself has had a really interesting and colorful history. It all began with Linus Torvald, probably you're familiar with. He's an employee now of the Linux Foundation, which is a fantastic organization, by the way. If you're not involved in some way with the Linux Foundation, at least signing up for their free events, which are, usually hundreds of dollars, just like a lot of these other conferences now are free right now while they're remote. Definitely take advantage of this community too. A lot of us who are involved in Open Source 101 and in all things open, you're going to see us talking at Linux Foundation events as well. There's just a lot of overlap between these various communities. So the Linux Foundation employs Linus Torvald, the inventor of Linux, and he just sort of posted to this open source mailing list, hey, I'm gonna do this free version of an operating system. It's not going to be a big deal, right? You can go and look up the post. It's kind of like a little bit of history. And it's funny because he was very humble about his ambitions for the Linux project when he first put it out. It really was just this, hey, let's make a free Unix variant. Let's see how it does. I think it's just going to be a hobby thing. And if you look at how this is now shaped, the landscape of free software since the first release of Linux, and then seeing it split into major distributions like Debian and Red Hat. Debian was one of the first Linux flavors that I really got super interested in and was building and everything like that back in the 90s. And it's still a very popular variant. You can still download pure Debian. It's what powers Raspberry Pi or Raspbian Linux is based on Debian. Ubuntu Linux is based on Debian. Of course, Red Hat, also a little software company that at the time was those of you who were in the industry at this time might remember that they were basically just a software catalog magazine. Like literally you could go and buy Red Hat magazine and you would have a software CD in it and everything like that. And they spun out their own variant of Linux, which became the Red Hat Enterprise Linux operating system. Now it's a free version of that. It's called CentOS. If you're kind of watching that, that's a very interesting space right now with the announcement of something called CentOS Stream, which is a rolling distribution of CentOS Linux. It's causing a bit of disruption in the industry. Anyway, Linux was profoundly disruptive in the industry, especially in the server side of the industry at first, because it really did bring all of the power of these commercial Unix operating systems to commodity hardware, and it was 100% free and open source, GPL driven, which means militant enforcement of free software. GPL is a very important license because it says if you want to modify the software, you have to share those changes with everybody, and that's what protects Linux and its innovation as an operating system. So fast forward to now, we saw pretty recently a huge acquisition, IBM acquiring Red Hat for it's like a $36 billion purchase, big bet on Red Hat's OpenShift technology, which is, of course, it's play for container-based orchestration based on Kubernetes and some of Red Hat's other curated technologies and technologies that it borrowed from other sources like Open vSwitch and things like that. We said pretty shortly thereafter, SUSE, is a huge Linux presence in Europe, purchased Rancher Labs as sort of a gauntlet, I think, to throw down in the container orchestration space. And if you had a chance to play with Rancher, I think agree it's really fantastic technology, and it's free and open source and allows you to spin out Kubernetes pretty much anywhere. But you don't have these things. You don't have a huge open source ecosystem, an operating system based open source ecosystem without Linux. I mean, Linux just drove all this. It provided fuel and a platform for all these other open source technologies to really flourish and move into the enterprise. And not enough, I think, is spoken about Linus Torvalds' invention of Git, right? I mean, he invents Linux and disrupts the operating system server market. And then Git, I think in many ways has been even more important than Linux as a foundation for social and collaborative coding and a real vehicle for open source development as a methodology. Right, so I really think you watch Git as a source control mechanism for all of these distributed open source projects that are meant to run on the Linux operating system, and it's just incredible, sort of the whole galaxy of free software that's available now that really is just sort of underpinned by Linux and developed on in Git using GitHub, and it's all been. It all interoperates. One doesn't really work without the other. So why think about developing on Linux? Now we understand some of the history of it. Why do people get so excited about putting Linux on something? I'm seeing a question come up. Will we have access to all these slides for future reference? Actually, they are already out there from the last time I presented this on my SlideShare. So if you just search for Linux 101 and you put my name in, you'll find the slides out there on SlideShare. But I think they're all getting posted again for this show too. So, and I did actually dust off a few things and make a couple of updates here. So as far as I know, yes, we're gonna have all this stuff posted. Speak to the coordinators about that. But yeah, it's by no means a proprietary talk or anything. You're welcome to it. Okay, so lots of reasons to develop on Linux. Powerful command line and tools, okay? Once you get comfortable using the command line, you can do everything on the machine that you could do using a UI, but you can do it faster and you can do it more efficiently remotely, okay? So logging in remotely to a Linux server that you might have hosted out on Amazon or Google Cloud or something like that, logging into it through a command line and console interface requires way less data pushed over. So you're not like streaming a desktop or anything like that, like you might be used to. And so, the idea of, running into glitches and issues when you're trying to administer that machine because of streaming problems or stuff, just doesn't really happen. Like you can use a command line effectively in very low bandwidth conditions and still be really effective on that box, okay? So, and it just gives you a nice ubiquitous and universal way to interact with the operating system. A lot of options for productivity improvement that come alongside that command line. So if you think about automating UI-driven applications, right? It's kind of hard, right? We look at a utility like Selenium IDE, for instance, for testing of web pages or testing of UI-driven applications, right? That's a very powerful platform, but it's complicated to record clicks and try to pull metrics back, and sometimes interacting with whatever messenger process is responsible for sending data between the view and the control and the model and everything. It doesn't quite line up with what Selenium is trying to pull out or its metrics. But when you're dealing with just text, when you're dealing with just a command line that you can throw commands at, you have a scripting environment then that can take multiple scripting languages and you can turn around and be way more productive. This is where it becomes really easy to administer a Linux box remotely using something like Ansible, or even spinning up cloud Linux assets using orchestration technologies like Terraform, right? It's the fact that you can be so powerful from just a text-based interface that just unlocks a whole lot of different productivity tools that are just harder it's just harder to do in a GUI, right? Is free as in free speech, and it will always be. Linux at kernel.org is under the GPL. The GPL, again, I really, go look at what the GPL software does, GPL licensing software does. And in fact, if you look, for me, I do a talk on, it's called Building the Holodeck. And I talk a lot about the GPL in that talk. And I talk about how important it is to have a license that says, hey, we can all have access to this software no matter what. It can all be free for everybody. But if you improve it and you want to use it commercially, you have to give that source code back. You have to. If you made it better, you have to give it back. And that's it. It's you don't have to pay anybody. You never have to pay anybody for anything like that. If you modify it and you improve it, you have to let other people know how you improved it, right? And that little mechanism is so important because you can, in fact, get sued as a commercial organization if you don't abide by that. And so there are some teeth, and that means that there is almost a militant enforcement of innovation on these products, which again, it's very important. It's easy for people to get greedy and try to take these products and go and create something new with them and then close them off. But that's fine. There's nothing actually wrong with that software development model. It's just a different software development model than open source. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's not Linux's open source development methodology. It's not Linux's development methodology, right? This is always going to be free speech, modifiable, customizable, community driven. You can do whatever you want with the software. Ease of prototyping, because Linux is meant to be a flexible server-side operating system. It just integrates seamlessly with the notion of a web server running on it, for instance, right? Instead of having a separate server process running, you do have a separate process running, but you're just sort of seamlessly integrated with the file system and file system permissions and security layers and stuff within the operating system. Because of that, because it's sort of ubiquitous and because it's like where all these other platforms that you might be developing against, like Node.js, if you're on the Node side, or Golang, if you like Go, Rust even, Rust is now starting to really come into Linux, and you've see a couple of articles that have gotten published recently on that. Because there's so much ubiquity in the operating system, it's really easy to prototype modern applications on Linux, right? So as a developer, it's just a very flexible environment to do all the things that you'd be expected to do, like develop an application that's supposed to run behind a web server, or run a really powerful Python environment to do deep learning. I mean, who knows, right? The point is, it's really easy to install free software on Linux, and you can deploy it anywhere, and you don't have to ask anybody before you do it. So, very easy to start prototyping your apps. Easy recreation of production environments. It's kind of what I was talking about. And this has been made even easier through utilities like Docker, right? One of the most powerful things that a container gives us is that parity between the area where we're developing and the area where we're deploying and running. And that's so important for DevOps. It's literally part of the 12-factor app development methodology. And it's, again, very easy to recreate production environments using Linux, because you just don't have much in the way of like proprietary or specialty stuff going in there in most cases. It's a very composable environment, so it's really easy to throw declarative configuration utilities, again, like Ansible and things like that at it. So it's very easy to make sure that where you're developing has parity with where you run your software. I think better web development, again, natural environment for Apache or Nginx. Hardened security options such as SE Linux. Go learn about SE Linux. Don't be afraid of it anymore. It used to be a thing where we all would fire up Linux, and the first thing we would try to launch a web server or something, and something would break, and we would get a permissions failure, and we're like, just disable SE Linux. Oh, great, it works. Well, don't do that anymore. There's a really good suite of tools out there available, tools like Audit to Allow, for instance, that make it much easier to embrace the way that SE Linux wants to harden your environment, and it makes a big difference, right? One of the examples of this that I like to point to, even though the example is getting a little bit old now, but for any of you who might be Android enthusiasts or have done development on Android, or even a little bit of Android hacking, maybe custom ROMs or bootlocker unloading or rooting or any of that fun stuff, right? You might remember, if you've been doing this for a while, that up until around Android KitKat or so, and it was like 4.4 or something like that, it was easy, right? It was just easy to find exploits. Even if the phone wasn't meant to be unlocked, you could go on XDA forums or something like that. Somebody had a utility out really quickly that could do it, right? It just wasn't hard to quote unquote break the phone. And it was, it was just a lot of times, sometimes the manufacturer would just allow you to do it, and that was nice. But other times you have to take advantage of an exploit, like actually an exploit in the operating system to unlock the hardware, right? Well, a lot of people who were in this, in this development community might remember that around the time of 4.4, Android by default started turning on SE Linux in an enforcing mode. And suddenly what was taking, developers a few weeks to figure out exploits around this stuff was taking like years. Like there were phones that were not meant to be unlocked that took like a year and a half to finally find a workable exploit to unlock. And the only reason for that was SE Linux. Like really, that's the only, that is the difference in how hardened you can create a Linux environment that has SE Linux turned on versus off. So learn more about that, especially if security is something that's going to be a focus for you. Absolutely pave the way for containers and microservices. The way that containers work rely on the way that the Linux file system works. And I'm going to actually show you an example of that. Automation through Ansible, we talked about that. Remote administration through SSH scales to huge sizes without license costs. And Linux makes you look cool, and it still does. It's the original home of the LAMP stack. So Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. This has evolved a lot since then. Now these tend to look more like Linux, Node.js, who knows, CouchDB or Neo4j or Postgres or something like that, or CockroachDB. I've seen a lot of that lately. And then, Node.js or Golang or something like that. Still a lot of PHP out there, obviously. Still a lot of other languages like Python, which are powering good platforms like Drupal or whatnot. But WordPress and Java is still relevant, of course, too, with Spring Boot, Tomcat, whatnot. All of these things, by the way, very easy to prototype in a Linux environment by design using free software again. Are there downsides to it? Sure. I think one of them is that there's too many different ways to create like Linux native apps still. We have all these different APIs and frameworks and runtime environments and tools. And this is important where it's I think, to stop for a second and consider what Linux actually is. So you've got the Linux kernel. That's the kernel.org code. That's the very minimum code that needs to deploy a basic Linux environment on a piece of hardware, so that anything running in that environment will have access to the hardware, network, processor, whatever. But it's extraordinarily bare bones. There's no UI. Even the default shell is very stripped down, right? So when you're using Linux, when you're using like a desktop class Linux, like Ubuntu or something like that, you're using the Linux kernel, but there's this suite of software that's often top-level projects that are going to be found in other flavors of Linux too, that are making up your whole experience, if you will, right? So you have the Linux kernel, but if you want to use a desktop environment, you might have heard of like Gnome or KDE. I'm going to show you pictures of those. Those are top-level open source projects of their own, right? There's obviously a lot of interplay between the Linux communities and those Gnome communities and stuff, but they're not locked to any one version of Linux, right? The Gnome UI is on lots of different flavors of Linux, right? And so is the KDE UI, right? And other ones. So the point is, we start with the Linux kernel, and then all these different flavors of Linux have kind of bloomed or evolved based on how those software communities have curated the supporting software, all right? So I start with my Linux kernel. What UI do I want? What graphical environment do I want, if I want one at all? How do I want to support printers on my network, right? There's a whole top-level project just for printer control called Cups. What command line interface do I want to use? Bash or Z shell or K shell or Korn, all these other ones that are available. It's a very pluggable operating system, makes it highly customizable. And that's why you see all these different flavors of Linux, like Debian and CentOS and Ubuntu, and these ones that are like coming in to replace CentOS Stream now, like Alma Linux and Rocky Linux and stuff like that. These are all based on who's the supporting community, what pieces have we chosen and curated, what other top level open source projects have we taken and added to this distribution to make a full operating system experience, right? So it's important to understand that, but with that comes a lot of fragmentation, and it can be a little overwhelming at first, especially if you've been used to what we would call a vertically integrated operating system, something like Mac or even Windows, where, your experience is pretty much on rails. There's other software that you're going to be able to install, but in terms of like what you get for your UI environment, how you're going to, take care of configuration, things like how you'll handle software drivers and updates and things, how you'll install software, those are largely sort of on rails, right? With Linux, you have a lot of choices. You'll end up really appreciating the flexibility, but at a 101 level, I understand it really can be overwhelming. And so it's best to, start with some of these highly curated versions like Linux Mint or Ubuntu or CentOS is, really a good approachable Linux as well. And get your head around how package management works and how those communities have curated that software and what your options are and how, the different mechanisms of installing software. Because then you'll start to understand sort of abstractly, how to approach these operating systems. Then you'll approach maybe a flavor of Linux that you've never seen before, but you'll know what questions to ask. You're like, all right, well, what's the bootloader? What's the package manager? What's the shell? What's the UI? And then as you start getting familiar with some of these, bits and pieces that really do overlap. I mean, for instance, Ubuntu, Debian, Raspberry Pi, a number of other ones that I just can't pull off the top of my head, all use the same package manager called apt. And meanwhile, you turn around and look at Red Hat Enterprise Linux or Amazon Linux or CentOS Linux or Scientific Linux or some of these other derivatives, and they all use the same package manager called Yum, right? And so you find a lot of overlap, but you really just sort of have to get comfortable with thinking about Linux as an ecosystem. But it is a challenge, right? Still an orphan desktop. Whoops, need to update that date. Even shows you I've gotten some mileage out of this presentation. We're still waiting on the year of the Linux desktop. And it's been kind of a joke. Now, what's funny is that we may already be here and not really know it, in that Windows now has a full Linux subsystem for Windows that you might be familiar with. It's a prerequisite for running Docker on Windows and things like that. And there has been all kinds of speculation when you look at the fact that like Azure Cloud now has more Linux on it than it does Windows Server and things like that. There's a lot of this like, well, could we actually be coming to a time now where one day Windows is actually just going to be a GUI layer, like a GNOME or a KDE that's sitting on top of a Linux kernel? And it's really, it's not hard to conceive of that, even though that would have been beyond crazy talk like 10 years ago. And before that, I mean, the stuff of legend. So I think one of the best quotes, but sign of the times quotes was when Steve Ballmer, Evangelist for Microsoft, called Linux a cancer that devours anything from an IP standpoint. And now again, Linux is #1 moneymaker for Azure Cloud. And there's a whole Linux subsystem baked into Windows, right? So things change. So how do you get started, right? Well, the first thing, you got to pick a flavor. Again, we said just the kernel with a suite of supporting software, and that's supporting software is what differentiates one flavor from another. So really, you want to pick one that kind of suits your level of expertise, what tools you think you're likely to use. I mean, be kind of thoughtful about how you want to use the environment. Is it a development environment? Do you want your IDEs like Eclipse and IntelliJ and stuff like that really accessible? Do you want to have Docker running on there right out of the box? I mean, is that the kind of environment that you're wanting to build? Or are you trying to build like an IoT environment for something stripped down, or just a fun project? Like I probably should have turned on my Office TV, but I have like a MAME project behind me that'll, do old arcade demo reels and stuff. And and things like that. So it really, think about what it is that you want to do. And sometimes, by the way, getting started with those small projects is actually, a really good approach. On the other side of my office here, I have a wall board, which is powered by an open source project called Yodeck, which is a special build of Raspberry Pi Linux. It runs on a Raspberry Pi, and it allows you to build a customizable wall board like the ones that you see in elevators and stuff. So you can put, RSS feeds and news feeds and custom stuff all over it. Right, so that's another way that you can get started, is to pick like a project like that. Main differences include package management, pre-installed software, the current Linux kernel version that's installed. Take a look at the community too. You really want a community that's quick to release. They respond quickly to security vulnerabilities. They have a lot, development priorities. Most of the mainstream flavors of Linux, you can get this information pretty easily. You can go to the main project site, click about, or the community section. It'll talk a little bit about the board of directors of the community, and you can understand how the community is governed. And that'll give you some clues about, the sustainability of this flavor of Linux and whether you should think about using it in your work and that sort of thing. Some distributions are also very highly focused. Like, for instance, Kali Linux for security professionals is one of the best known, I think, niche focused versions of Linux. It comes pre-installed with a whole bunch of like white hat hacking tools like Metasploit and Nessus, things like that, and really is everything that you could need to do, like high grade professional penetration testing. I mean, this is what the professionals use. And so it's very interesting because, Linux has helped provide this very open playing field for white hat security researchers. So it's actually very transparent and easy to understand how security researchers are testing software infrastructures now and what tools they're using to scan. Something for everybody, just a whole bunch of flavors here, really just demonstrating that there's a lot. This is not even close to an exhaustive list of icons. Cross-platform development on Linux is getting a lot easier. So there is now cross-compiling options, especially if you look like .NET 5, for instance. Now you can just get a Docker mono instance and start running .NET 5 applications in Linux. For full virtual machines are available in VirtualBox, QEMU, Vagrant. Vagrant, if you haven't played with Vagrant, is a very good way to get started with Linux. Like today, you can just download the Vagrant tooling and Vagrant up CentOS, and all of a sudden it's going to download a VM image for you and spin it up and everything. You start using it. Libraries and platforms for cross-platform deployment of like Windows applications into a Linux environment, also getting easier with tools like Wine, which stands for Wine is not an emulator. It's actually a full rebuild of the DLL library for Windows and the main Windows runtime. File systems now are good and interoperable. So for sharing files between, like a Windows environment, Mac environment, Linux environment, there are some good, cross architecture file systems that make it easy to share files between those things. Let's go to a question. What flavor do you recommend for a public library? The library only has Windows, and I'd like to suggest to them to have a few machines with Linux. It's a great question. For something like a public library, you want to consider a few things, right? I think local security and security policy, very important, right? These are public machines, and so you don't want anybody to be able to, do anything nefarious with them, and you want to be able to lock them down pretty well. You also want something that's supported, and by that I mean you don't have to think a lot about how often you want to update and everything, and that's because, especially in a library environment, a computer should just be a tool, right? You shouldn't have to worry too much about it. So for something like that, I would look at an enterprise class Linux, but I would look at a free one. CentOS Stream is the newest rolling release, as we call it, version of the free version of the Red Hat Enterprise Linux operating system. So using CentOS feels almost identical to using Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So very friendly for setting up. There's a good ecosystem, works well with printers and all that great stuff. But with CentOS, it's 100% free and open source. It's because of GPL that this exists, right? It's a binary equivalent to Red Hat. Now, the streaming part of this is kind of new. CentOS Stream, the CentOS community has said they're going to focus on the stream distribution. For a server environment, for server environments, that's been problematic for some businesses who are not fully DevOps mature yet, who can't do CD yet, fully automated CD. It's been a little problematic for organizations like that. For a desktop environment, not a problem, right? I mean, for the most part, in a desktop environment, you kind of have a rolling release anyway. You have update Tuesdays and you're taking updates often. If you don't like something, you can just uninstall it or whatever. So for an interactive like desktop environment, the stream concern really isn't that big of a deal either. I've been using stream now for a while and it's just fine. It really doesn't mess up too much stuff, but I certainly understand where people are a little concerned on the server side with it. We have some tips around that too if you're interested. But yeah, I would probably say CentOS is a great pick for a library environment. If that seems too enterprise server for you though, you just can't go wrong with Ubuntu as a desktop operating system. It's user friendly, it's stable, it is enterprise class, it is what we call kernel 4, so it's getting compliant with newer kernels. So you really can't go wrong with that one either. And if for some reason you just don't like how Ubuntu looks and feels, I highly recommend then Linux Mint, which is very close to Ubuntu, but it strips away Ubuntu's kind of canonical inspired semi-proprietary UI and then gives you a more open source feeling UI with all the power of Ubuntu, Linux Mint. So you really can't go wrong with any of those three. I have kind of a preference or an overall bias for CentOS in general, just because their focus for a long time has been on security and multi-tenant security and really enterprise features and functionality. So I guess if I were making the decision for you, I probably would go with CentOS Stream. Hope that answers your question. Okay. So you're familiar, things that you're looking for as a developer are here on Linux for you. So I'll check my time really quick. Good, I think we're all right. So things like Eclipse, for instance, IntelliJ, editors like Sublime Text, classic command line editors like Vim, Emacs. These are all available to you. And with Linux package management, it's actually easier to install this software on Linux than it is on other operating systems. Other operating systems are catching up, right? If you're on a Mac, you might be familiar with Brew or the Homebrew ecosystem. That's a nice way to install free software on the command line from Mac. That's just catching up to the way that we have been installing software on Linux forever, which is just using command line package management tools to go grab free software and install it. I mean, again, pretty much everything that gets installed into a Linux environment through the package manager, if you haven't installed special repositories or anything, is freely redistributable software, right? So you don't really have to do anything to put it on your machine. You don't have to run an installer. You don't have to agree to a license in a lot of cases. You can just one line apt-get install Sublime and you get Sublime Text right into your Ubuntu, right? Or yum install net tools and you'll have all your network utilities inside of CentOS, right? So very easy to install the software. If you're looking for a similar experience before you jump though, check out Chocolatey. If you're a Windows user, the Chocolatey package manager is going to give you kind of a similar experience to being able to install free software on Windows. It's nowhere near as prolific as you'll see with things like Yum and apt on Linux, but it does kind of give you a similar software installation experience, if you will. On your first install, generally the installation media is going to be provided for you in the form of some type of bootable ISO file. You're going to be able to configure your system and your network. Sometimes you'll be able to choose a theme for your pre-installed software, like for instance, CentOS allows you to kind of pick the type of environment that you want to build. And then from there, you can use a preferred package manager to install software and deliver what you want, build from source if you need to. So here's a picture of installing like the CentOS 7 operating system. And you can kind of see, this isn't scary. On the left, we're saying we want to, Gnome is one of our GUI environments. It's a top level open source project. Another one, KDE here. These are our GUI environments, but we can just choose which one we want to pull down and install. Again, these are both completely free, available through public repositories. And during the install, it's just going to either copy them off a CD or it's going to just download them from public repositories and set everything up. Maybe I want to have Office Suite and productivity tools, as well as some internet applications on here. I want to have compatibility with older X Windows, older Linux GUI stuff. Right, so I can just choose stuff. I could create a basic development environment here. And so this is, again, a way to kind of pick a theme, because all this software is free, sitting in public repositories, it can be easily curated into a whole operating system. So it looks like I got some stuff showing up in Q&A here too. .NET Core on Linux, it's getting better. I'll say that. .NET 5 is actually pretty impressive, the stuff that I've been able to see run so far. And it's pretty clear that Windows is making this a priority, or Microsoft is making this a priority. So, at first I think it was a little shaky. It's really, really getting better. Used to play with Fedora, still fairly new back then. What is the best Linux system to get started with right now? I've heard Ubuntu is good. Ubuntu is great, but I also really like Linux Mint. And then on the other side of that, if you really want to do something that's going to set you up for enterprise class work, CentOS Linux. And then what was the name of the Raspberry Pi wallboard? You're using Yodeck, Y-O-Deck, Yodeck. Yeah, just go to yodeck.com. Yeah, it is commercial past a single user license, but it's all based on free software. But for one wallboard, totally free. And it is pretty cool, actually. I think you'll like it. There's a whole cloud-based interface for configuring it. It's pretty cool. All right. Well, let's keep going here. We've only got a few more minutes. GUI options here. So this is, Gnome. So we saw Gnome in the last slide. This is what it actually looks like. And it's inspired by Mac OS X, right? So if you're familiar kind of with Mac OS X, there is some stuff here that's going to look familiar to you. There's plugins like a dock and everything. This is KDE, which is more kind of inspired by Windows, so more of a start menu field. Specifically, this is KDE running in CentOS, right? And you really do want to embrace the shell, okay? Maybe not on day one, but you do want to get comfortable with the shell because you're just going to be more productive. You're going to be better at administering Linux on cloud. You're going to have an easier time navigating between like maybe a local Linux environment or even like on-prem server environments for your business and then cloud environments, right? You really do just want to get comfortable with that. In Linux, everything is a file. And although it may vary a little bit from this, this is going to be the basic overview of how the file system looks. You're going to have a bin directory where what we call our system's essential binaries. You may have user bin and things like that too. But this is where we're going to run software out of, right? etc is our configuration, right? So most of our system config is going to live somewhere inside of this etc. If you want to go and modify parts of the environment, networking, storage, things like that, startup scripts, all that, that's going to be living somewhere in this etc environment. You'll need to have elevated privileges in order to modify it. var, variable data files. If you're putting a web server on this thing, generally the web server lives in var www. Again, go back and review this. I want to say though that the fact that everything is a file in Linux, literally everything, means that when applications want to communicate over a network or communicate with hardware or other processes in the environment, they do so by interacting with these files. That allows us to have things like Docker, which set up fake or shrewded environments for these things. I'd say kind of go out and play. Just a couple of tools here. Yeah, I know those screenshots are a little old. Yeah, I need to update this. I got this couple-year-old presentation. Enterprise hardware vendors can build and develop on Linux. Sometimes consumer hardware can still be a little bit inconsistent. You might have to wrestle with your laptop a little bit. The Grub bootloader is generally what you're going to be interacting with if you want to dual boot between Windows and Linux. Refind is a nice utility that allows you to boot Linux on Mac hardware, even older Mac hardware. I see some other questions. I just want to power through these last few slides and we'll see if we have time. This is actually Linux running inside of a VM. So you can see here Mac OS X running, and then inside it we have, I think this is actually VMware Fusion. So VMware in here, you're running Linux Mint now inside of a VM inside of Mac. So if you don't want to make the full commitment and install it directly on the hardware, you can run it as a VM. You can run it inside of a container. Ventoy is very cool. This is pretty new. Universal ISO booter, it's really useful. You can go and burn this onto the USB drive, and then you can just copy ISOs right into a folder and boot them directly. Linux Live, Lily USB Creator, also very nice for quickly getting started with it. Raspberry Pi, I mentioned this a few times. $35 box gets you everything you need for a full Linux desktop environment. Really great way to get started. And then feel free to reach out to me too if you have any questions after today. I know we didn't get to everything. Let me see. 10-year laptop barely runs Windows 10. Installing Ubuntu or something else, Linux Mint. Put Linux Mint on that. It's going to run great. Security concerns, Linux flavors. There's always security concerns. But, you know, I think, and there's malware on every platform. But with Linux, you at least have some safeguards like SE Linux and whatnot that minimize the damage that can be done to an environment. Okay, I think we're right at the 3:30 mark. I think I actually hit all the questions. So thanks again for all that participation. That really helps. I appreciate the feedback. I hope to see you all in person in a year or so when the next time that we do this event. Thanks again for the time. Feel free to reach out if you have any more questions.